Our agenda tonight is Psalms 87 through 90, and we start with a psalm that will be very opposite in tone from the following psalm. So if you'll, before we start that, let's get to our handout for tonight. What type of psalm do we see in Psalm 87? Anyone like to recommend a category for this one? It could be messianic. In fact, it does seem that most expositors believe so, and it certainly has parallels with the Messianic era, even if it wasn't directly written that way. So we'd certainly have to consider that one. I also think of it as a liturgical, or it's a psalm of praise as well. And I'm going to try to discuss it first in terms of the likely original meaning, and then I want to go back to some of the practical lessons, and we'll discuss what Dathan had recommended a moment ago. So the first three verses you might think of as a description of God's glorious city. It says in verse 1, "His foundation is in the holy mountains. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God." And so what we note off the bat here is that this is a place that God has in very high esteem. And the fact that God holds Zion in high esteem is the only thing that makes any difference about this particular place. This is the place that God chose to put His name. It was the place that He had alluded to through Moses in Deuteronomy, for example, that God would choose a place to dwell permanently. And it took a few generations, at least until David, until it was nailed down exactly where the Lord's dwelling place would be represented on earth, and that is in the highest peak on the mountains of Jerusalem. And this is a place that isn't necessarily to be regarded in a carnal way or by man as especially noteworthy. I mean, it was a hill, and it was strategically a good place to have a capital. It was difficult for enemies to conquer and all that, and that's not what I'm talking about. There were other mountains that could have been thought of as more grand, other places that people from a carnal point of view would have chosen. And as you think about Psalm 68 that we studied recent weeks, that was the kind of discussion there that, why do you look with envy, O many-peaked mountain? Because this is the place God chose, and that's the only thing that made any difference. It's high because it's high in the esteem of God. And that's the lesson, I think, to glean from those immediate verses there. For more on that, you might read Psalm 48. Now, the next few verses here talk about the city and its influence. And so as we read there in verse 4, "I will make mention of Rahab and Babylon to those who know me. Behold, O Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia, this one was born there. And of Zion it shall be said, this one and that one were born in her, and the Most High Himself shall establish her. The Lord will record when He registers the peoples, this one was born there." Selah. So we have a natural break there after the next three verses. And what we see here is, in these verses, this influence that the city has, because the city not only is high in the esteem of God, it's written in an era when it was high in the esteem of others. Now, a lot of expositors believe that this psalm was written during the days of Hezekiah. And one of the easiest ways to make the case for that is based on the reference in 2 Chronicles 32. So after the Assyrians had tried to conquer Jerusalem, they took over 40 cities of Judah, and they, as they bragged, they pinned up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. And what happened after that was Hezekiah goes to the Lord, and he asks for deliverance, and God answers in the most magnificent of ways. And the Assyrian army, to summarize a whole lot here, the Assyrian army went to bed and woke up dead the next morning, so to speak, 185,000 soldiers. And that ended the threat against Judah at that time. In fact, it ended the campaign of Assyria among this region of the world. And the rest of the commanders went on home, and then Isaiah summarizes, what really took place about 20 years later was the king of Assyria died. But really the threat ended in this part of the world with what happened there with the angel of the Lord that killed 185,000 soldiers. Now, the rest of the nations responded to this by sending tribute to Hezekiah. They sent presents to the Jews, and this is in an era when you might think it could easily have been written that these verses here, that as you see other psalms, such as the nations here, or other places in the prophets, that these surrounding nations were envious of the Jews. They lusted after the land. They looked for every opportunity they had to invade. And yet, this is written in an era when the Jews were held in high regard. And it's because of what God had done in his legacy of deliverance for his people. And certainly, I can't argue with anyone who believes that this psalm could reflect those very days. It could easily have been written then. Now, what you see here, though, is that this is written with a kind of reputation of the Jews and God defending his people. That's the direct opposite of what we saw in Psalm 69. Now, as you see the kind of sentiment there that he says, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell upon me, meaning David bore the brunt of the hatred people had for God, the enemies who hated the kingdom of God, the enemies of the Jews, and it sometimes would include people of his own nation. He was persecuted by Saul for years. And all of this is also referred to in the book of Romans 15, I believe it is, that as it applied to the Messiah as well. Those who hated God pour out that kind of hatred on his servants. And it's reflected in the way that they treat God's people. But we see the very opposite of that here, that this is a case where the nations can see the difference. It's much like what you saw in 1 Kings 10 when the Queen of Sheba came and she interacted with Solomon, and she went away saying, I haven't heard half of what I should have been told. How blessed are your very servants who just operate in your presence from day to day. There's no nation like this. And this is the kind of scene that we think of as we read these verses 4 through 6. And then finally, the last verse there closes with a reference to the bounty and the joy that exist in the city. It says, both the singers and players on instruments say, all my springs are in you. That is, this is the source and the place that they can live and they can thrive. And it's only because of what it's referring to in the opening verses there that this is the dwelling place of God. Okay, now that was brief. We might make some application to the Messianic era at this point. So, what practical lessons or anything else you'd like to add to our discussion so far might you like to offer from Psalm 87? Well, you might say, for one, that nations rise and fall, but it's only the interaction with God's people that ultimately made history significant. If you think about it, a person like Pontius Pilate, no one would even know who he is except his brief interaction with Jesus. You think of Cyrus the Great, for example. There's not a whole lot known about him personally, but I don't think even a fraction of the people would know his name except for what he did in fulfilling God's will and in returning the exiles back to the land. The nations come and go, but somehow this little sliver of land in Palestine has changed the world, and people today can still find it on a map. Whether or not they can find other countries is one thing, but people can find Israel. People know who the Jews were, and this is the kind of fact that makes this consequential. Now, as far as implications for Messianic era today, what you see here is the people in the foreign nations, that they hold in high regard the people of God. And now we learn from Ephesians 3, verse 6, for example, that the mystery has been revealed. The Gentiles are fellow partakers with the Jews. They're all fellow heirs in God's promises and in the covenant now under the covenant of Christ. So certainly the kind of influence that the Jews had is in the days that this psalm was written now consummate into an era when all who from these foreign nations can come and approach God and dwell with Him as well. Now, one other thing we might mention, I'm trying to be brief because we have a lot to get to tonight, but please speak up if you have something to add. Our influence on the world is meant to honor God. And you think about the sentiments that are mentioned here, that this is very idealistic, and it was, in fact, the case during the days of Hezekiah. If there's something you want to put your finger on, this was real in terms of the people who had God and His people in such high regard. But there's also quite the opposite effect that would happen just a short time later in Ezekiel 36, that when it became necessary for the Jews to be exiled from their land to Babylon, as the prophet there rationalizes, it had to be done because the Jews, as they had blasphemed the name of God everywhere they went, it was absolutely necessary for God to defend His righteousness by punishing sin. But then it was also necessary for Him to bring them back. And there's a little more to the discussion there in case you'd like to read that on your own time. But then finally, the whole world benefits from God's favor to His people. If you think about the parable of the parable of the wheat and the tares, actually, if you read that one, you'll notice there, about verse 29, that God's long-suffering is for the purpose of His own people. His long-suffering wasn't simply with the wicked. Now, truly, if God had no long-suffering with the wicked, there would be no righteous either, because we all have to come to repentance. If God answered every act of evil immediately, none of us would be here either. And that's certainly the case. But the way it's expressed in that parable of the wheat and the tares, God's long-suffering was performed on behalf of His people, lest they be uprooted while He uproots the evil. And the whole world benefits from that because they have more time to come to repentance and to a knowledge of the truth. And then, say, an acted-out parable, if you will, is seen in the life of Paul. As he was traveling to Rome in chapter 27 of Acts, he suffers shipwreck, and yet it had been promised that if everybody stayed with the ship, not one life would be lost. And you see there that on behalf of God's people, His favor was able to be benefited by others who otherwise would have no claim to it. The whole world benefits from God's long-suffering. Okay, anything else you'd like to add on this psalm before we move on? Okay, so Psalm 88, this is a psalm we couldn't pick two in a row, I suppose, that could be this opposite in tone. And many expositors refer to Psalm 88 as the darkest moment in the Psalter. It is quite dark, but I don't think it's as dark as we often say. Now, there isn't a whole lot of, say, directly positive expressions in this psalm, I'll give you that. But there are some very important bright spots that I want to call attention to. So, now this psalm, who wrote this psalm? I'm sorry, I should be following our handout tonight. Yeah, from the sons of Korah, and even refers to Heman the Ezrahite. Now, this reference to Heman, and then the author of the next psalm, Ethan. Now, these are a couple of names that we see elsewhere in the Bible, and more on that when we get to Psalm 89. But what would you call this as a type of psalm? Sure. A lamentation, yeah. Yeah, a plea, a lamentation. Certainly you'd have to include both of those. Now, we'll get to practical lessons in a moment. Now, this psalm has it is written in the first person. Okay, so the psalm would easily be something you could connect with when you are suffering personally. And I don't want to take anything away from that. I personally, though, tend to read this as if it reflects the nation and not an individual expressly. Now, I don't want to discourage anyone from making this in a personal application, but I'm just saying there are psalms that I believe are written better or read better as if it expresses the nation through the first person of a character. For example, Psalm 129 is in that category, as it opens with, "Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth, let Israel now say. Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth." Now, it's not saying greatly have they afflicted us. It's not written in the collective in that way. But this is just one of the cases where it's obvious in Psalm 129 that we see the singular pronouns, and it's written as if it's about one character, but it's actually reflective of the whole nation. I tend to read Psalm 88 among that category, but I'm not going to fall out with you if you don't see it that way as well. Now, there are other places in the prophets that would do the same thing. Lamentations, for example, as it describes there in chapter 1, as if there's a young girl that has been abused and basically left for dead on the highway, and people are passing by. Most of them don't care, and the rest of them are glad about what's happened. That's the kind of picture that the Jews were in after Babylon had come and taken the captives from the nation. Lamentations 1 does that. There are several other occasions where you might find something very similar. Now, more on that in just a moment, because some of the references to the hopeless situation in the grave, I think, are easier to understand as you read it from that point of view. However, Psalm 88 is a psalm that has a very desperate situation and someone who turns to God in that dark hour. So let's look at it from that point of view. The first two verses, "O Lord God of my salvation, I have cried out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to the grave." So what we see here in the opening verses is that this is a desperate situation and someone who's going to God continually to seek aid. Now, as you see there, the next few verses, "My soul is full of troubles, draws near to the grave. I am counted with those who go down to the pit. I am like a man who has no strength, adrift among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, and who are cut off from your hand." Now, I don't believe that the psalm is teaching here that there is no hope for us after the grave at all. On the other hand, this is a common metaphor used of a nation that has been humbled by God. You think of Psalm 9, verse 17, "The wicked will be turned into hell, and all nations that forget God." Now, that same metaphor of those who go down to the pit, I think if you go back up to verse 15 there in Psalm 9, there's an extended metaphor of that in Ezekiel 32. There's a description of what you might call the graveyard of nations, as the Egyptians would soon be visiting this graveyard. It says that they're going to go down and lie among the unclean. Assyria is there and all her company. Elam is there. Edom is there. You have this whole list of other nations that have gone down to the pit, the ones that are down in the grave. They're down in the forgotten land. No one fears Nebuchadnezzar anymore. No one fears the king of Assyria or the king of Babylon, the king of Egypt. All of these are nations that have gone down into the pit, and they're powerless to hurt anyone anymore. And God has turned the page on those nations because they had to be judged for their sin. Now, this is the kind of thing that was not to be permanent with Israel. As Jeremiah had said that I will make a complete end of all the nations to which I will drive you, but I will not make a complete end of you. Now, that's not to say, though, that those weren't the feelings as you go through the Babylonian captivity. As you think of Ezekiel 37, for example, the valley of dry bones, Ezekiel was shown in the vision there, this valley with dry bones, and they're scattered all across as if a great army had been defeated. And by the time you get to dry bones, it's too late to revive those soldiers. In fact, it's been too late a long time ago. And as God asked Ezekiel, "Can these bones live again?" and he doesn't know quite what to say, and he says, Lord, you know. And then in the vision, sure enough, those bones do come back to life. But this is the picture of the Jews in that situation. They felt just as hopeless as if they were a valley full of dry bones, their nation cut off. They had what they believed to be no hope anymore. And yet with God, there is always hope. But this is the kind of thing that that era, it would feel like. Now, on the other hand, if this psalm is merely reflective of the personal troubles of an individual, then we have someone here that's very near to death, or someone who believes he is. He says he's adrift among the dead in verse 5, like the slain who lie in the grave, and they're cut off from God's hand. So I don't know if any of you have felt quite this low before, but this is not the kind of confidence that you see from David in much of the other Psalms. You know, I think it's actually quite helpful if you think about it, that we don't have the same tenor, the same tone from each one of these Psalms that are a plea or a lamentation. Now, David, for example, is like a man who has been on so many storms out on the sea that he sees the next waves coming and he doesn't panic because he's been through so many troubles over his life. He has so much mileage under his belt that he has expressions in the Psalms that are just full of confidence. Now, most of us who haven't had that same kind of experience, we aren't there yet. And what we do here as we talk about all of this is practice. But out when you face this in the real world, that's when it gets real. And that's when you don't necessarily have that confidence without any experience. And so I think it's helpful to at least see this wide spectrum of experience related to us from the Psalms, that you have one who's earlier on in the process here than David would be, as you see in other Psalms when he says, fret not over the evildoer. Now that sure is easy to say, isn't it? Because if anyone had an excuse to fear evildoers, it would be someone like David, wouldn't it? As he was chased and threatened and ran for his life so many times, there's a process involved in learning endurance. And this one, I believe, reflects those that are earlier on in the process. Now, anything to add on that before we go to verse 8? This is clearly a grave situation, whether it reflects an individual or whether it reflects the nation as a whole. Now, what you see in verse 8 starts to discuss in this paragraph that there's no obvious help or no signs of obvious help coming. As he says that he has no companions. He says, verse 8, you have put away my acquaintances far from me. You have made me an abomination to them. I am shut up. I cannot get out. My eye wastes away because of affliction, in verse 9. And yet you also see here that he attributes the troubles that he's going through to the work of God himself. And on the one hand, it was common for Jewish writers to attribute what God allows to something that God approved of, and especially in wisdom literature like this. But on the other hand, if it does in fact reflect what happened with Babylon, then God himself did do these things. And he made it very personal. You read Ezekiel 24. He says, I will do it. My eye will not spare. I will not show pity. I will fulfill these very words that I promised to cut off Jerusalem. And so if that is the case, then what we have here is, I believe, the faithful remnant who is suffering as the collateral damage because of what the wicked nation has done. And yes, certainly it's been the ongoing dilemma for people to understand that the righteous do suffer on account of the wicked. It is part of living on planet Earth. It's part of living among people who need to repent and come to the knowledge of the truth. But nevertheless, he says that you've put away my acquaintances far from me. It's as if he has no helpers. And as you read a lot of this, it also does remind us a bit of Job. And in fact, if it had said it was written by Job, I think we all would have no trouble accepting that. Now, Job had some acquaintances, but unfortunately, they weren't far from him. They weren't very helpful, as you recall. Now, he says in in verse 9, my eye waste away because of affliction. Lord, I have called daily upon you. I have stretched out my hands to you. Will you work wonders for the dead? Shall the dead arise and praise you? Now, again, I don't think that we're talking here about a situation that it's not teaching that there's no life after death, or because we all can read from the benefit of our New Testament revelation that the dead, certainly who are in the presence of God, praise Him continually. They praise Him on a constant basis. Now, what he's writing about here in these verses, in verse 10 and so on, verse 11 says, shall your loving kindness be declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in the place of destruction? Shall your wonders be known in the dark, and your righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? Now, he's writing this from a human point of view. And what he's struggling to understand is how the situation that he's going through, or else as the nation as a whole is going through, how it can honor God from a worldly point of view. Now, as you think about how there are times when Moses, for example, would plead with the Lord to relent from disaster on the hopes that other nations wouldn't blaspheme God as if He was unable to deliver His people. And that was all a valid way to argue. Now, suppose on the other hand that someone has a fine house, but there's one problem. It's just infested with rats and termites and critters and things that you really can't live in it. And so his way of dealing with it is burning the house down. Now he has no house. And now he may have gotten rid of the critters and the problems there, but he's got another problem now. And it's hard to understand why someone would take measures like that to deal with something if there was some other way. From a carnal point of view, this may be how the captivity appeared to Israel. That is, yes, they had wickedness that needed to be answered. And you had prophets like Habakkuk who were interested in seeing that happen. But how does it honor God for His righteous people to suffer? And that's something that has been difficult for people to accept. It is often perplexing. Why is it honoring God for His servants to die? Wouldn't He be more honored for His people from a worldly point of view if He could separate the righteous, and then that would leave a better impression upon others? I believe that's an acceptable way to read that paragraph that goes through about verse 12. Now, one of the things you see coming up here, though, and it's a thread, as we saw this in verse 9, we saw it at the beginning, that he continues to go to God in prayer. He says, but to you I have cried out, O Lord, in the morning my prayer comes before you, verse 13. It says, Lord, why do you cast off my soul? Why do you hide your face from me? And what we see here in the closing paragraph here is that he doesn't appear to be on the verge of giving up or letting go. He doesn't appear to have any more resolution to his problem, and he doesn't have any more answers. And yet, he continues in his endurance, because endurance has to be learned by experience. It can't be learned from a book. And what we see here is an example of someone who's determined he's going to stay near God through those trials, through those difficulties, whether he has any answers for his problems or not, because there is, there's a horrible expression that you hear from time to time, as someone will say, all I can do is pray. And depending on how you mean that, it might be all right, but I don't like the way it sounds. It's almost as if you think, I'm helpless, I'll pray. But we're not helpless. And that's one of the lessons from Psalm 88, that continue to go to God in your darkest hour. And do you really believe that He can deliver you? If you don't, then it's no point in praying to Him. But stay near, even though no one else is with you. As we see in this psalm, there are no acquaintances there to support him, but he has God, and God will not leave him to suffer. Okay, any practical lessons to offer from this one?
Well, like we already said, I was thinking that I don't think many of us say the things that he's mentioned here, how bad it's got. I mean, we live in a good country, but if we ever did go, have to do the same treatment, at least we have an example now that they had the same thing. The point is to continue, like you said here.
Exactly right, yeah, that's right. What you see here is someone who's not going to give up. He doesn't see any way out, but he sees God. Now, we'll just have to go over these briefly. In fact, we basically have talked about the first one, that turn to God in your darkest hour. Now, next is remember reverence. Now you notice that there's no anger or lashing out at God here. There's no venting. What you see is a lamentation. You see a plea. You see some desperation. But you don't see someone who lashes out irreverently toward God. And this is a lesson that Job had to learn the hard way. Job started out very well, and yet once he started to say some things he regretted as God appeared and spoke to him and challenged him, and Job at the end said, I put my hand over my mouth. I'm done talking now. I regret many things that I said. I don't want that to be said of me. Now, the Apostle Paul also in 2 Corinthians 1 talked about some desperate straits that he was in as he traveled in Asia and had difficulty so much that he despaired. He despaired of life. I think he was resigned to the fact that he was going to die. I don't think he was despairing of his faith at all. As you see there, though, in 2 Timothy 4, as he neared the end of his life, he talked about how so many had forsaken him, only Luke was with him. But then he goes on to make an expression of faith that God was with him, and God would fulfill his purpose for Paul. And if his purpose is for Paul simply to endure and be an example of faith, he was ready to do that. And that may well be something that he requires of us. Okay, anything else on this psalm before we go to 89? Okay, so I think we need a little bit of background on Psalm 89. And I want to talk about it a little bit thematically before we get into the text itself. As we were talking about a moment ago with Psalm 88, I think the two of these are very good as companion psalms. And they're both very useful in terms of reflecting a point of view that you don't see in many other psalms, say as David, the more experienced man, had learned to trust in God through the difficulties that he faced. Someone said that David lived to be about 70 years old. And for most of us, at least in this era and the easier way of life that we often have now, most of us at age 70 have a lot more in the tank than David did. It says David was very old, and it was as if he was out of all of his strength by the time he reached that point. It's not really the years, it's the mileage. It's the difficulties, the troubles that he had lived through. Now, you think about the years that David had fled from Saul. 1 Samuel 27, even after David had spared Saul twice, and they apparently reached a reconciliation, David still says, I will perish someday by the hand of Saul. And he seems to be resigned that David will never be able to stop running from Saul. Saul will always chase him. And then you see Psalm 37, as we alluded to a moment ago, he says, fret not over the evildoer. Now this is a man who's learned endurance, but he learned it through a process. He learned that confidence through the trials. And I think it was Haley perhaps that said that Job was a man who was perfect in all of his ways, and yet he was missing something, and that was steadfastness. And because that's not something that he could have learned except for the things that he went through. And there was a purpose intended by the Lord that was very different from the purpose intended by Satan. But Job came through that in his endurance. Now, just as we were saying in Psalm 88, there's no explanation, or shall we say, there's a lack of understanding on Psalm 88 to how to resolve the crisis. Now, Psalm 89, there's also a lack of understanding, and it's something that's very vexing. It's perplexing to the psalmist here. Now, the kind of dilemma he's talking about, we'll get into the specifics here briefly in a moment, but just know that even though there are no resolutions offered in Psalm 89, there are resolutions offered by other places in the prophets. Jeremiah, for example, is going to pick up some of the very expressions used in this psalm and offer God's response. And as we said there in a more generic way, Ezekiel 37 is also meant to do the same kind of thing. God often answers, but he answers with weight. It may not be yes or no. It may be not now. And I think this is an example of that in an extended way. Now, the authorship here is offered by Ethan the Ezrahite. Now, this is a man who does appear to be referenced in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 31. It is alluded to there because Solomon is said to have been wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite. Now, a lot of expositors will assume then that Ethan was a contemporary of Solomon. Well, I think it's possible. I don't find that persuasive, and this psalm is the reason. Now, the reason I say I don't think he was contemporary, it would be a bit like saying Abraham Lincoln was a better leader than, and then name 5 senators from his current day. I don't think that would be very meaningful to us today. However, if you name 5 great leaders since Abraham Lincoln, if you can find 5 great presidents, I'm not going to name names, I'm just saying, all that would be necessary is for us to be familiar with who they are because they lived through history, right? Ethan didn't necessarily live in the days of Solomon, but he must have lived by the time that the Kings were written, which certainly would have included the exile. And so I do believe that the circumstances offered here fit the exile of Babylon better than in the days of Rehoboam, the days of Shishak, when the king of Egypt, came and besieged Jerusalem and plundered Rehoboam's kingdom. And I say that because it does appear from the way that this psalm is written, Ethan cannot see a way that God's covenant to David could be fulfilled. As in, the nation hasn't simply been humbled. It looks impossible for God's covenant with David to be fulfilled now. And that's really the dilemma that he's struggling with throughout this psalm. So more on that in a moment. Now, since he can't reconcile these things, he appeals to God for help. And so what we see here in the way that the psalm starts out, it's talking about the greatness of God, the faithfulness, the permanence of God and his righteousness, and how he will not let his words go unfulfilled. It starts out in a very praiseworthy way. And then it turns to the part that's difficult to follow, the part that's difficult to understand. And I think there's a lesson in that for us in a more of a, say, indirect way. That is, if your faith is shaken and you're facing answers or facing questions that you don't have answers for, don't start with what you don't know. Start with what you know. Okay? I, for one, don't claim to have all the answers that skeptics might throw at us. Okay? So those who don't believe there is a God, those who don't believe the New Testament is inspired, I don't think I can answer every question satisfactorily. I mean, I'm working on those, but I think there's a lot of them that I'm going to struggle to really satisfy some of those questions. Now, however, I cannot believe there is no God. Okay, so I'm going to start with that. And also just know that the skeptics can't answer all of their questions either. They can't answer all of ours. And so there's always going to be this realm of unanswered questions, because I don't think tossing God out of the equation makes it any easier to explain those difficulties. Now, Ethan also seems to follow that same kind of pattern here. He starts with what he knows. He knows that God is faithful. He knows God has made this covenant. And so then he's going to deal with the part that he can explain. Now, we need to review God's covenant with David very briefly, and we don't have time to go through all of this slide, but this was basically the situation in 2 Samuel 7. The prophet came to David and promised that, or God had promised that he would make a permanent line of kings that came from his seed. These were kings that if they were faithful, their sons would be faithful, and they would persist in that kingdom forever. It was a permanent office, and ultimately it's fulfilled in the Messiah. But more on that in a second. The promise to David had implications for the physical land. It had implications for the physical kingdom, and it had messianic implications. Now, as far as it goes, the physical kingdom there was not going to be a king if there was no people living there, because they had forsaken God and he had to do what he had promised in the law of Moses. That is, there is nothing about this promise that canceled what was promised through Moses that if you're unfaithful, you're not going to be living here at all. And certainly they had to go through a time like that. You see Deuteronomy 28 through 30, for example, to make that point. But then you also see that the messianic aspect of it was unconditional. That is, the Messiah would come through the Jews, period. There was nothing they could do to stop that. God chose Jacob. He chose the Jews to bring the Messiah into the world. Now, what we learned from the promise to David was that it would be even more specifically through David's seed. It would be through the line of kings that would come from David's descendants. And this is what is often referred to in Isaiah and in preaching of Paul as the sure mercies of David. Now, certainly this wasn't fulfilled in David himself, because as you see in Acts 2, it was pointed out as the reference from Psalm 16, David has been dead and his tomb is still with us to this day. It wasn't possible to fulfill that with David the man. But certainly David and his royal seed was what was targeted here. But the messianic aspects of it were unconditional. So just keep that in mind. Now here's a brief outline of the psalm. It starts with a description of God's character that's highly praiseworthy. Then it summarizes the covenant with David in verse 19. Then we see circumstances that, as we say, Ethan feels cannot be reconciled with God's promise. And then he finally makes an appeal at the end based on all of this we've seen. So let's look at this very briefly. What you see in the first 18 verses is this. He says, I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. Now there's something we need to make mention of here, that this word here, the mercies of the Lord. Now this is a very special word in the Hebrew language. I am not a Hebrew expert, and I might even be mispronouncing it. But the word hesed, you might look it up in Vine under loving kindness, and I have the number there on the screen. Now, this is a word that is difficult to translate directly into English because there isn't a one-for-one translation that's just perfect for us. But you think of it as faithfulness. You think of it as an obligation to go beyond a mere statutory requirement, but there's a desire even to be generous beyond what you've agreed to. And the translators often use the word mercy, which is supported by the Septuagint as well, in the parallel there in the Greek. But you also see loving kindness, and then in the ESV you see steadfast love. And so this is all very well, but reading cases of it make it a little easier to understand. So you see in Psalm 62 verse 12 that he refers to the God of Hesed, who renders to each according to his works. Now that would include judgment and blessing. Okay, so that is, God is going to be faithful to his word, and he's going to execute his judicial decisions based on his faithfulness to what he has pledged to do. Now, this is one of the words he uses as he described to Moses to explain his character. That is, that he is in the paragraph starting in chapter 33 of Exodus and going into chapter 34, that he is gracious to whom gracious and merciful to whom merciful. And he goes on to talk about how he doesn't leave sin unpunished and so on. I'm trying to summarize a whole lot here, but this is a word that's used very frequently in the Psalms, and it's the word that he starts with here. That is, he knows it's part of God's character not only to do what he has said, but he expects God to go even beyond it and to be generous and to be merciful. Now, the next few verses there talks about God and his dominion over his people, that justice and righteousness are the foundation of his throne, verse 14. And so he says, mercy and truth go before your face. Blessed are the people who know the joyful sound. They walk, O Lord, in the light of your countenance. So we had skipped over this in verse 3. He says, I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to my servant David, your seed I will establish forever and build up your throne to all generations. And so this is what's on his mind as he's writing this. Now, as you get to the next paragraph that starts in verse 19, there is even more description of the covenant itself. That it says in verse 22 that regarding David, the enemy will not outwit him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. But he says, verse 24, my faithfulness and my mercy shall be with him, and in my name his horn shall be exalted. And at verse 30 goes on to, 30 and 31 are also echoed in Psalm 132 in terms of the general pattern that if David's sons were faithful, then their sons would persist in the royal line. But all of that is dependent upon there being a kingdom in the first place. So as we said, the promises to through Moses that God would punish wickedness if the people forsook God, none of that was canceled, and that continues here as well. But David's enduring line is described here, verses 30 to 37. He says, verse 35, once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His seed shall endure forever, his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, even like the faithful witness in the sky. And so here we have, say, an immovable object. What God has promised cannot be canceled. But then verse 38 starts with the part that he can't reconcile given the circumstances that he's living through. I would suggest that this was written during the exile. He says, but you have cast off and abhorred. You have been furious with your anointed. You have renounced the covenant of your servant. You have profaned his crown by casting it to the ground. You have broken down all his hedges. You have brought his strongholds to ruin. All who pass by plunder him. He is a reproach to his neighbors. You have exalted the right hand of his adversaries. You've made all his enemies rejoice. You've also turned back the edge of the sword and have not sustained him in the battle. You've made his glory cease. You've cast his throne down to the ground. The days of his youth you have shortened. You have covered him with shame. And so it would seem pretty clear here that what they're living through, it looks impossible now for God to fulfill his word. At least he can't understand it. And just to summarize some of these things, it's as if the throne has been cast down, humbled, and humiliated before others. And so what we have here is finally closing an appeal. How long, O Lord? Will you be angry forever? Hide yourself forever? Remember how short my time is? In other words, this paragraph reflects a sentiment that if God's promise to David has failed, then we truly have no hope whatsoever. He says, what man can live and never see death? In other words, we're all going to perish if we don't have God keeping his word. Now, he closes with saying, blessed be the Lord forevermore. In other words, whatever the circumstances, I'll continue to trust him. And I think of, as well, the closing words of Habakkuk 3. At the end of that psalm, he does compose a psalm, but at the end of that chapter, he says, basically, even if I have to starve to death, I'm going to stay loyal to God. And that does seem to be the kind of thing offered here, that even if we can't offer a satisfying explanation, we're still going to trust him. Okay, thanks for your patience tonight.